Hello, this is Feral Vincent. Villainy, debauchery, and all manners of depraved, terrible, awful things that we can do. We are approaching a new topic, a new understanding, a new revelation. You see, every villain has a story, and every story deserves to be told. The key to making a good villain, a villain worth following, a villain worthy of the title, a villain so evil, so backward, so terrible, is to have a story and to understand that story. In Final Fantasy 16, our villains are a bit generic. You don't understand them, you don't know why they are doing what they are doing. And this, my dear viewers, has to be fixed. Because villainy is an art, and I'm a master at the craft. Every good story has a few key elements. Generally, with fantasy, and especially power fantasy stories, which is what you're going to run into the most in role playing games and the gaming sphere and genre, are going to generally follow a few different elements. The two main things that you can do right when writing a good antagonist, a good antagonistic force, is to make that force known and to make that force powerful. You do not want it to be weaker than your main character, both in a actual power setting to where the main character needs to level up in order to catch up to the main bad guy, but also it needs to be there from a character perspective too. The best way to have a good, solid, and relatable villain is to make sure that you spend time understanding their character, why they are a villain, how they became a villain, and what makes them special above everyone else in what they do. Antagonists can be an individual, it can be an organization, it can be a group of individuals. It does not have to be a singular entity, but it is an entity that should have a reason for doing what it does other than bad guys do bad things to good people. If you ever have a story like that, you're going to run into a situation where it gets a little bland and boring. I think a great example of this kind of bland and boring villainy, if you will, is from those old school um, shows that used to be on SFX, right? The Sci-Fi Channel. Um, and I always think back to the villains that you ran into in like Firefly, the Nomads or whatever they were called. Basically, Ravagers, I think, or I don't remember their exact name. And it doesn't really matter. If you ever check out the show Firefly, the main thing that they're running from is this group of sort of depraved, mind ridden, like lost in themselves group that just likes to go around and slaughter. I mean, they're really kind of boring. And a lot of the reason why Firefly didn't work isn't because the characters that you followed weren't interesting. It's because the villains sucked. There was no reason to invest in that show. And you can kind of contrast that to a show like Game of Thrones, even though I don't particularly enjoy that show myself. I only made it to season 3. They at least knew how to write a good character. And I mean that from a villain and from a protagonist perspective, right? The heroes, the guys you wanted to root for and the guys you didn't want to root for were all well written. And that's why the show went on as long as it did. So as it relates to Final Fantasy 16, the antagonistic forces that I'm aware of so far and can speak to in some level of detail are Annabella Rossfield, Benedicta Harmon, Barnabas Farmer, and the Iron Kingdom and Willowed, right? Those 3 main areas, if you will. I believe we don't know much about Barnabas, so I'm going to be saving him, I think, in a large way, as well as Willowed and the Iron Kingdom. We only have snippets of them so far in the story. I know they're going to be antagonistic forces, I can tell. But really, I don't have a lot that I know about them to be able to speak in any direct way. So, the big issue that I run into, especially with both Benedicta and Annabella, is I don't know why they are bad guys. And I want to be really specific. With Annabella, she starts off the game as sort of this person who has a lot of contempt, a lot of hatred towards Clive. She doesn't like him because he did not get the blessing of the Phoenix, I guess. And she generally just always shows this sort of contemptual nature towards him. It's almost like a pity, like a status, right? He is lesser than his little brother Joshua because he did not become a dominant of Phoenix. And this makes some level of sense if the character has this sort of real big tie to their bloodline. And if you read the descriptions of Annabella Rossfield and you really start to understand what she believes in as you read the codex, you do get a little bit more of that understanding that helps you to get a better idea why she doesn't like Clive, right? She believes heavily in her bloodline. She believes heavily in lineage. Seems like the Phoenix is everything to her. And this makes some sense because she is actually Elwyn's cousin. So they come from a similar bloodline, which makes that whole intimate scene a little bit more creepy when you look back on it, but you have to read to find this out. It does not come up, right? You don't know that she is this sort of like, I don't know what best to say, but basically like family member who was married to Elwyn so that they can try to produce a phoenix. Like that was the whole reason they got married. So that's why Elwyn and Annabelle don't like each other. I don't quite understand why they are together still in that regard. Like it feels like they should be a little bit more separated. Understanding this now. But again, I don't like that I have to read that to know that about her. Also, why is she tied so heavily to lineage and the Phoenix? Like, why is this a thing for her? I couldn't tell you to save my life. I don't understand her motivation for selling out Rosaria or Rosaria to uh, the Sanbreque Empire, right? I don't understand why she defected, other than she wanted to save her own skin, but that doesn't completely make sense. If she's all about lineage and she's all about making sure that the Phoenix is there and that she can keep him, why is Joshua not protected more by her? Why did she let him leave without her, basically? Like, I'm surprised to think about why she would allow the Holy Empire to send assassins to kill him and, you know, Elwyn and Clive. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I understand the idea of selling somebody out for political power, but it feels in contrast to her motivation of the Phoenix bloodline, right? So these two odds ends, you don't get much from her in terms of exposition, in terms of things that she has said in the game, in terms of cutscenes or and screen time, right? You don't get a lot of that from her, and so that makes her kind of feel very hollow and weak, right? That's why she's a poorly written bad guy. Now, it would be another thing entirely if to both Clive and Jill, she runs into them on the way out, on the way, out of the mud pits, if you will, or out of the castle as they're leaving one day, and really gets a chance to put them in the dirt. um, that would be a smart choice cinematically towards making her a better character if she could, approach both Jill and Clive and really just look them dead in the eye and just say, like, you know, you are less than human. You do not deserve to be here. You're no better than the branded, right? And if she could say something like that, that's in contrast to even Elwyn's motivations, right? Elwyn, who is this father figure to both Jill and Clive, who believes heavily in branded being free men and being treated as equals, or at least better, it makes it way more fun for the terms of the story and in terms of what you get from it, right? Fixes Annabella in a lot of ways because now you can start to understand why she sold out Clive at the very least and Elwyn to the Holy Empire. And I think it would be kind of fun if she didn't know that Joshua was going to be at the Phoenix Gate, right? And then when you cut to the Phoenix Gate and she's walking around as, members of Sambrake are murdering Rosarians left and right, if she's looking for Joshua, if she's trying to find him, if they don't already know that he is dead and she's trying to act all tough and, all of these other, like, she needs to be beat up in this moment, not stoic, not perfectly fine. Like, I don't like that she isn't a wreck right now. It'd be interesting to see her hovered over or holding Joshua's cloak or clothes or something that's on the ground nearby, or even, if we have to go to the dead body route, we can, but just a piece of Joshua, something that's a physical manifestation as she's crying. And these soldiers are just mercilessly slaughtering the people around them and around where Joshua fell, to really get that feeling of hopelessness, that I would expect from somebody whose entire identity is wrapped up in this one little boy who just died. And that makes you even more upset when she's a bad guy longer and longer into the game, because at least you understand why she defected. If she thought she could protect Joshua from Senbriquet, and if she thought that this would get her a political edge to where she could control that political power and really make sure that she had this joint kingdom going on that ultimately fell apart, and now she needs to pick the pieces back up and put them back together. So I think that could help fix Annabella and our very first antagonist of Final Fantasy XVI. But what do we do about the second one? Benedicta is a tricky character in this regard because her story is told in its entirety from my own perspective. I know where her beginning is, I know where her middle is, and I know where her end is. So, spoiler alert for Benedicta. She is originally the main intelligence officer of Willowed. She shares a past with Sid. She's been in a romantic relationship with at least two other characters. Uh, Kupka, which is the dominant of Titan, you see that in the intro cinematic in the hallway, as well as Barnabas Tharmer, the um, sort of emperor of Willowed, right? So you kind of get these two sides to her in that regard, where you can kind of see where she's using, her feminine charms and wiles as a means to disarm men, to gain power, to continue to further her own agenda. But what the hell is that agenda? So far, I can tell that her motivation in the game has been very much so survival for quite a bit of it, and that's the part that Sid understands, right? Sid understands the survival aspect. That's when he found her. And then she gets in touch with Barnabas and, you know, Hugo, Kupka, right? The dominant Titan. But why did she get into relationships with them? I don't know. Why did she choose to go after other dominants and hunt people down? And why did she become cruel and unusual to various people? Like, you see her kill people in cold blood fairly frequently. And that's not somebody who is trying to survive. That is not a survival mechanism from a person, right? Her motivation for why she is where she is now is what doesn't make any sense. I could see it if, as a younger child, she always wanted to be in a position of power, right? I could see it if she always had a dream of being more, of being bigger, being grand, if she had delusions of grandeur, if she was maybe a little bit more self centered, um, if she kind of gave off more of a vibe that she cared only about herself or her looks, her appearance, if that was her strive for perfection, you can kind of start to get into that mentality of her being better than these people that she's slaughtering. And I think that's there. It's just not shown very well. It also does fly in the face of the Benedicta that Sid took in. So It's hard. um, it's very hard. But it to fix Benedicta, right? Let's move on to the next part of this because I don't want to delve too much on what it could be. Let's go with what we do know. And how do we fix it? I think showing her being self centered and being egotistical and kind of using this a bit more is great. I feel like her interactions with her soldiers can do this actually. Just adding a little bit more interactions of her commanding people around to do things that aren't easy or that aren't safe, and using that as a means to show rather than tell what kind of person she is in that regard. Um, taking those scenes where she's torturing various people and stabbing them and doing all these other things to gain leverage starts to make a bit more sense when you get that ego and a little bit more of that I'm better than everyone else or you are lesser than me, that kind of a thing. It does follow a similar vein to Annabella, though. So that's the trick with this one in a story or a narrative perspective is now you have these two female antagonists that are very similar, right? They're very, very similar. They're both trying to save their own skin. They're both trying to please a ruler for political power and gains, right? So the method by which they do that does need to vastly differ, and I don't think it will, because Annabella, to my knowledge, only has her feminine wiles and charm, right? Benedicta is also a dominant of Garuda, which makes her immediately and immensely more powerful and useful. So there is that. The other thing to contend with is how we end up dealing with making her story arc a little bit more favorable, right? I feel like Sid needs to start to win with her. That the sort of best way to handle the stark juxtaposition of character would be the common denominator of Barnabas. I think playing up this sort of corruption of herself, the loss of herself to this stronger, more dominant personality would be a very good idea. Show pieces of that toxic relationship that break her down, that force her to be submissive to him, that force her to really have to listen to Barnabas, and show her slowly accepting that as her own reality as the gaslighting takes hold is the best way to do that. And it takes time and it's triggering. So I can understand why they may not go with that option, but I feel like making it so that you sympathize with her before she dies is a smart choice. I also wouldn't have her be dead right when Sid gets to her. In that moment, I'd make sure that they have a chance to talk, that she has a chance to apologize. She kind of comes out of it briefly right before she goes. Because that kind of a story makes it so much more scary as the rest of the story unfolds, right? As this narrative continues. Because now you have this character that you want to succeed. You are invested in her growth and development. And that, my dear viewers, is a much better villain. Give her a failed redemption arc, and you can get away with a bit more. My 2 cents, at least. I wanted to record this section a bit later than I originally had planned. And the main reason behind that is I find myself in a situation where I found out a little bit more about Benedicta as I was playing most recently, and I'm noticing that I feel more for the character than I did before, right? I made some early assumptions about where they were going with the character, and it didn't really pan out the way it did, or the way I thought it would. And so I wanted to make this little section and keep the original so you could hear it, to really say, like, that is the direction that they went, and I'm glad they did. You know, the end of Benedicta was really done well. And so I feel like she became a better character as time went on, and you can kind of see how that plays out in the game itself, right? You can feel for it as time goes on because she is a character that ultimately was manipulated by Barnabas, who lost herself and her morals, had a very traumatic and rough experience going into it that's a little triggering, right? When you start to read between the lines of that character, it's a lot more complicated and it makes it a lot more fun and enjoyable to interact with. So I just wanted to show some of those moments as well at the end of this character's arc to say that she is a much better character at the end. And so I'm going to go ahead and play that clip before she basically loses herself and is no longer Benedicta Harmon and is just a mindless, sort of broken person at the end. Because it is a very good clip to show the way somebody should deteriorate if they really were somebody who was all about survival, who, you know, had all this trauma and then found somebody who manipulates that trauma into making them do or say things that they don't believe in, and then watching as that world comes crumbling down, where they stop being useful to that person, where they stop being able to be that person to that individual, and what that does to their mentality, what that does to them. And the moment they realize how helpless that makes them feel is gut wrenching. And I like it. I know it's mean, but I like it. So, without further ado, trigger warning. Please remember to skip this part if you need to. These are a few tools to fix what I know of Final Fantasy 16's first real two antagonistic forces, Annabella Rossfield, Benedicta Harmon. I'll get into the rest of them as the game goes on. I know there's going to be more. But at least for now, I feel like both of them are underwritten. Both of them need a bit more time to share that light with the main character, or at least some small but impactful cutscenes to help you understand them and maybe sympathize with them a little more. Because really, the main part with both of these characters is that at no point did they feel more powerful than Clive. Well, maybe a little bit with Benedicta when she first turned into Garuda, but I mean, after you started stomping the hell out of her, it wasn't all that impactful, right? It felt like it was a little too easy, a little bit too little of an inconvenience. It should have been a little harder. I wanted Clive to be a little more damaged from that. But Annabella, I mean, she just got everything and doesn't seem to be phased by anything that happened to her despite her whole identity being completely destroyed. So I feel like these two characters are needing of a little bit more writing and a little bit more character and a little bit more development, because I feel like their goals are ambiguous, and I feel like the writers of these particular characters didn't fully have an idea of how to best write them to where we would understand their motivations. And if you are making a villain for a game, a story, you know, just to have fun, really understand what it is to be an antagonist. Again, you need to be human. You need to have an understanding of why they believe the way they do. Even if you don't agree with it, you need to understand why they believe the way they do. They need to be proportional strength to the main protagonistic forces. And they need to be a goal, they need to be a challenge. Because if you're going to give them screen time, if you're going to make them an antagonist, if you're going to give them space, make sure they hold it. They may not be the main antagonistic force, but they should be a force. And if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out a lot. With the videos, I'd highly recommend you ring that sub notification bell because it will help you see these videos. They don't seem to show up on everyone's feed quite as much. I have to look myself up. So just as a call out, you may want to double check if there's anything you've missed on that particular playlist. Consider giving this video a like, and I would love to hear from you guys in the comments about what else you'd like me to make some Final Fantasy XVI content on, or content you want to see from other games going forward. Thank you guys so much for your time, and I will see you on the next one.